Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into, well, a really fascinating and honestly a deeply charged conflict. It all revolves around one word: evidence.
Yeah, specifically in autistic language research, there's this big battle going on about how we prove something works.
Exactly. And the establishment gatekeepers, they often demand what they call the gold standard, right?
Yeah.
Randomized Control Trial, or RCT.
But our sources today are looking at Gestalt Language Processing,
Mm.
GLP, how many autistic people learn language using whole scripts or chunks. And they argue that demanding an RCT for this isn't just setting a high bar, it's actually asking researchers to cause ethical harm.
Wow. Okay.
And this pushback, it often comes from proponents of, let's say, older traditions, like applied behavior analysis, ABA, or verbal behavior approaches. They're asking, if GLP is so great, where are your RCTs?
Right. So that's our mission today, then. We're going to really unpack this thought experiment that the source material lays out. What would it actually take to run one of these gold standard RCTs for GLP?
And maybe more importantly, what does trying to design that reveal about, well, the politics of evidence itself? Who gets to decide what counts?
Yeah, who gets to define progress when we're talking about something as fundamental as human communication? Okay, let's get into it then. To really grasp the ethical issue here, we first need to understand just how mismatched the measuring sticks are. I mean, what are we actually trying to measure when we say a child's language is growing?
That's the key question.
Yeah.
Because how GLP defines progress is fundamentally different from how traditional behavioral science often sees it. They're almost measuring different things entirely.
So what does growth look like for a Gestalt processor, according to GLP?
Well, it's definitely not about just counting single words. The real substance of growth is more subtle, more human, maybe. One of the big markers is called mitigations.
Mitigations, okay.
Yeah, so that's when a script, maybe a line from a movie or something that the child uses rigidly, exactly the same way every time starts to soften, it gets reshaped.
So like they bend it slightly, make it fit the moment better?
Exactly. They make it a bit more personal, more flexible for the context. The chunk is still there,
Yeah.
but it's not just a recording anymore. It shows they're starting to play with it.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Then there's recombinations. This is a really critical step. It's when a child takes a phrase or part of a script they know, say blast off from one context, and joins it with a completely different one, like need juice, to make something new and personal, like blast off, need juice, meaning maybe I want juice really fast.
Huh. Okay, yeah, that's definitely a leap forward, mixing and matching those chunks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's true generative language starting to emerge from that Gestalt base.
Oh.
We also look at contextual flexibility. Can they use an echo or a script in a new place where it still makes sense?
Right.
And critically, porosity. The melody, the rhythm, the up and down of the voice. So often the emotional meaning, the intent, is carried in that tune long before the words are broken down into neat grammar.
You can hear what they mean, even if the words are a script.
Precisely. And finally, affect regulation. Are they using scripts purposefully? To calm themselves down, to protest something, to share a laugh, to connect. These are the real functional signs of progress on a Gestalt path.
Okay, so that's the GLP picture. Now let's contrast that with the yardsticks that, tend to dominate the established research, especially linked to ABA. They're looking for different things, right?
Totally different things. And honestly, those nuanced GLP markers, they often get dismissed entirely in that tradition. They're focused on stuff that's, well, easier to count and tally.
Like what?
The big one is often mean length of utterance, or MLU. But here's the catch. They typically only count segmented individual words.
So if a child says a 5-word movie line as one chunk.
Right. The ABA measure might count that as just one unit. Or worse, they might see the fact that the child hasn't broken it down into 5 separate words as a sign of a deficit, a language problem.
So the very thing that shows GLP progress using the whole chunk is seen as a failure by the other measure.
Exactly. The child's actual communicative strength, the gestalt, the melody, the meaning carried in the chunk, it's invisible to that particular measurement tool. It doesn't register.
What else do they tally?
Things like prompt compliance. Basically, how quickly and reliably does the child follow instructions on command? That gets treated almost as the definition of language skill. And they'll count discrete responses, track how quickly a child can segment speech, break it down into those little pieces. The source points out that in this view, the script is often seen as a problem to be fixed. The echo is an error, and that rich prosody, just noise getting in the way of counting words.
Okay, so the core argument here is pretty stark then. If you set up a research trial using only those traditional analytic behaviorist measures.
The GLP approach is basically set up to fail from the start. Not because it isn't working for the child, but because the tools being used are blind to the kind of growth it fosters.
The instrument itself decides the outcome before you even start.
That's the crux of it. It's like bringing a sundial into a swimming pool to measure water depth. The tool just isn't built for the job. It guarantees you'll find nothing. The measures were designed for an analytic language path, and when you force them onto a Gestalt path, the Gestalt path looks like it's going nowhere.
But hang on, wouldn't the counter-argument be that, this isn't malicious, that science needs reliable, objective, countable data, that maybe mitigations or prosody are just too subjective to measure properly?
Oh, absolutely. That argument is made all the time. But the source pushes back hard on that. They argue that words like reliability and objectivity can be weaponized.
How so?
Well, if the dominant methods define reliable as easy to count discrete units and objective as ignores messy context and internal experience, then you've built a system where ethical practice, the kind that actually meets the child where they are with their Gestalt language, can never qualify as evidence-based.
Because it doesn't fit the predefined box for evidence.
Exactly. You're demanding the child's communication change to fit the measurement tool, instead of adapting the tool to understand the child's communication.
Which brings us to the really sharp edge of this. Why isn't demanding an RCT just seen as, methodologically difficult but potentially unethical in this specific context?
Right, and to get the weight of that ethical claim, we need to quickly touch on something called institutional review boards, or IRBs. The ethics committees that oversee research.
Yeah, every university or hospital has one.
Well, the source emphasizes that the whole reason IRBs exist, this entire structure, was built directly in response to historical horrors. Think Nazi experiments, think Tuskegee. The absolute bedrock principle that came out of those atrocities is, first, do no harm, especially to vulnerable groups, like children.
So protecting people comes before collecting data.
Absolutely. That's the prime directive. And it means we have to look really clearly into what the source calls the cold mirror of the hypothetical RCT that's being demanded for GLP.
Okay, so paint that picture. What does that required trial look like?
Well, standard RCT design. It requires random assignment. You take a group of kids identified as Gestalt processors, and you randomly split them. Arm A gets the GLP-informed support. Their scripts are welcomed, maybe even celebrated. Their therapists actively help them make those mitigations and recommendations we talked about. Their prosody is listened to as meaningful.
And Arm B, the control group.
That's the ethical sticking point. For the comparison the critics demand, Arm B would likely get the standard older ABA-style drills. Their speech is targeted for segmentation. Scripts might be ignored or actively discouraged, and progress is measured by things like compliance and discrete responses.
Oof. Okay, I can see the problem brewing.
And the core ethical principle that gets violated here is called equipoise.
Equipoise, meaning?
It's a fundamental requirement for ethical trials.
Yeah.
There has to be genuine uncertainty within the expert community about which approach is better. Or, uncertainty about whether either approach actually helps more than doing nothing.
So if researchers already have good reason to believe that the GLP approach helps these specific kids thrive,
then withholding it from half the children in the study, the ones randomized to the control group, just to get a clean comparison, that crosses a line. You're knowingly risking harm, potentially delaying or disrupting their natural language path for the sake of the study design.
You can't ethically withhold something you believe is beneficial and necessary.
That's the argument. The source says designing this study is withholding vital language support from half the kids. Randomizing them effectively declares that their way of communicating, their voice, is negotiable, something we can sacrifice for academic neatness or, frankly, for market positioning.
It creates this really uncomfortable situation, doesn't it? This ethical inversion the source talks about.
Exactly. You end up where behavioral interventions, even those with documented histories of causing distress or trauma for some autistic individuals, do count as evidence-based because they managed to get those RCTs done years ago, maybe under different ethical standards, or before GLP was well understood.
While GLP is treated as suspect, not because it fails kids, but because its supporters refuse to subject kids to that same potentially harmful comparison group.
Precisely. Their ethical stance, refusing to withhold support, gets twisted and reframed as a methodological weakness, a failure to produce the right kind of evidence.
It sounds like a demand for sacrifice just to get into the club.
That's essentially the critique. A demand to pay an ethical toll for admission into the circle of approved science. It forces practitioners into a terrible choice.
So if running that kind of trial is potentially unethical, does that just mean GLP kids are, I don't know, destined to be ignored by the research world? Uncounted?
Well, that risk is definitely there, and
Yeah.
it's made worse by another hurdle, a really practical and political one, that the source calls engineered invisibility.
Engineered invisibility. What does that mean?
It starts with a basic structural problem. Gestalt language processing isn't officially recognized in the big diagnostic manuals used in the US, like the DSM, or in medical billing codes. There's no box to tick for Gestalt language processor.
And the consequence of that is?
It makes it incredibly difficult to recruit a sample for a study. You can't just search a database for kids with a GLP code. Finding them requires what the source calls unsanctioned labor. Meaning painstaking work, interviewing teachers, SLPs, parents, combing through narrative reports, trying to identify kids based on descriptions of their language, their echoing, their scripting, their intonation patterns. Not a neat label. It's messy, time-consuming work that the current funding systems and academic structures just don't incentivize.
So the difficulty in finding them becomes a convenient excuse.
That's the argument. The system can then say, see, the population is too hard to find, the trial isn't feasible, therefore there's no evidence. But the source insists this isn't a natural lack of evidence, it's engineered. It's created by the system's refusal to create the categories or value the labor needed to find these children. It's a manufactured absence.
Okay, this definitely feels like it's moving beyond just methodology into a critique of, well, power dynamics. This sounds like a turf war.
That is absolutely the core critique the source develops. They argue that these hierarchies of evidence, RCTs at the top, clinical observation way down below, aren't really about a pure search for truth. They're about territory.
Territory.
Yeah, market position, professional authority, funding streams. The source contends that GLP is often dismissed or ignored because fully recognizing it, validating it, would pose a direct threat to the dominance and, frankly, the business model of ABA and related industries.
Like the science of reading debates, maybe? Similar dynamics?
Very similar dynamics mentioned, yeah. It's about maintaining control. The source uses strong language. They call it an enclosure, a deliberate walling off to protect a guild's empire of practice and profit.
Wow. Okay. And within that enclosure, what happens to all the real-world stories? The parents who say GLP methods finally unlock their child's communication, the therapists who change their whole practice based on seeing it work, the autistic adults who explain how scripting was their path to language.
That gets systematically devalued. It's dismissed as just anecdotes or subjective or parent bias or practitioner bias. Basically, anything that isn't a number from a controlled trial gets sidelined.
But the source wants to reclaim that.
Yes. They argue passionately that this is evidence. They call it lived evidence or a counterledger. Data that's written in the child's progress, spoken in the classroom interactions, observed directly by those closest to the child. They say that counterledger, the moment a script did soften, the day two chunks were recombined into something new and joyful, ought to carry weight against a void created by methodological gatekeeping.
Okay, so if the traditional RCT is ethically problematic and maybe even politically weaponized, but we still want reliable knowledge, what's the alternative? How do we learn more without sacrificing kids?
Great question. The source definitely doesn't say, don't do research. It says, let's use research designs that generate knowledge ethically without requiring that harmful deprivation model. We need designs that build knowledge over time or across groups differently.
Like, what are some examples?
One really strong alternative is the stepped wedge design.
Stepped wedge. How does that work?
Okay, so instead of having one group get the intervention and one group get nothing or less for the whole study, you roll out the interventions sequentially. Imagine you have several classrooms or clinics.
Right.
You start by giving the GLP support to one group. Then after a set time, you introduce it to the next group, and then the next, until every group, every cluster has received the intervention.
Ah, so everyone gets it eventually.
Exactly. The comparison isn't between getting it and not getting it. It's about the timing. You compare the outcomes of groups before they got the intervention versus after, and you compare groups who got it earlier versus later. It satisfies that ethical need. Everyone gets the best known approach, but you still get rigorous comparative data.
That immediately sounds much better. It avoids that deliberate withholding. What else?
Another powerful approach is the classic longitudinal cohort study. No manipulation, no control groups in that sense. You simply identify a group of Gestalt processors, and you follow them over time, months, years.
Just observe their natural development.
Yes, but observe systematically. You collect rich data,
Hmm.
Regular language samples, video recordings maybe, detailed logs from parents and therapists. You track those GLP markers, the mitigations, the recombinations, as they actually happen in real life. It maps the trajectory. It might be slower to yield results than an RCT, but it's deeply ethical and reflects reality.
And you mentioned moving outside the lab, too.
Absolutely. Creating practice-based registries.
Yeah.
Think about it. SLPs, teachers, therapists are already working with these kids, already keeping notes, already seeing progress.
Right, there's tons of data already out there, just maybe not standardized.
Precisely. So the idea is to develop standardized ways for practitioners to code and record those specific GLP milestones, mitigation types, recombination complexity, how prosody is used functionally. If many practitioners contribute their real-world observations to a central, anonymized registry.
You build a massive database of evidence from actual practice.
Exactly. The evidence grows organically from the work being done to help children, not from an artificial trial setup. And we should also mention autistic-led mixed method studies, where autistic researchers themselves help design studies that combine quantitative data with the crucial qualitative insights from lived experience.
Yeah, bringing those perspectives together. And the source does point out, right, that it's not like there's nothing out there now, even without RCT.
Oh, not at all. It's crucial to remember the landscape isn't empty. There are foundational books, like Marge Blank's work from 2012, which describe GLP based on deep clinical observation long before this RCT debate heated up. There are practical guides used by therapists now.
Action research happening in classrooms.
Constantly. Teachers and therapists adapting what they do based on the child in front of them. The sources suggest the path forward isn't about desperately trying to mimic the old guard's methods, but about confidently asserting that these other forms of knowledge, these lived trajectories, are valid and powerful evidence in their own right. So wrapping it all up, the core argument from the sources we looked at is pretty stark. The current system, the way evidence is defined by those in power, effectively makes causing harm the price of admission for validating GLP. Demanding that specific type of RCT isn't really a neutral call for scientific rigor in this context.
It's seen as a demand for an ethics violation.
Yeah, and a demand for sacrificing the communication development of some children for the sake of comparison data that fits a pre-existing mold.
So the takeaway isn't necessarily that GLP lacks evidence, but that the absence of this one specific type of evidence, the RCT, might actually reflect its ethical strength. It reflects a refusal by practitioners and researchers to inflict that potential harm just to get the gold standard stamp or satisfy certain funding bodies.
That refusal is the evidence of prioritizing the child's well-being.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a final thought from the source material to consider. Absence of evidence is never emptiness. It is, more often, a refusal to look. So think about this in your own world, maybe your job, your field of interest, even a hobby. What important knowledge, what critical lived experiences might be getting dismissed or ignored right now simply because they don't fit the dominant, established gold standard of proof? And who benefits from keeping things that way, from that refusal to look? Thank you for diving deep with us today.